All right, thanks everyone, and especially big thanks to the organizers, both for the great program, the great workshop, but also for giving me a morning slot since I just arrived from Europe yesterday. It's good to present while I'm still awake. So in this paper, there'll be no tracks. Instead, I ask how platform design affects gender differences in content creation. And more specifically, I study gender differences in negative feedback and how they impact the productive output of content creators as a form of self-employed workers on an online platform. And more broadly, this is motivated by the observation that despite it having been well documented that rising female labor market participation is good for aggregate productivity, the progress seems to have slowed and the gender gaps very much persist. And there are many reasons behind that, of course, but one important set of contributors is that women and men still very much experience the workplace differently. And I contribute to this literature by studying one way in which women and men might have this kind of different experiences in the workplace, and that's differences in feedback, specifically negative feedback. And I study this in the context of the digital economy, not only because that's an important setting to study by itself, but also because that allows me to very precisely observe the feedback received, as well as the kind of response in terms of the output and the demand for that output. Specific setting I study is YouTube, which is the largest platform for user-generated content, both in terms of professional content creators, as well as the number of consumers of that content. And to causally identify the effect that differences in negative feedback might have on content creation, I use variation from a change to platform design that YouTube implemented at some point. More specifically, what they did is they changed their interaction tools by removing the number of dislikes that a specific video receives from public view. So previously, you were able to dislike a video and also see how many other people dislike that video. And right now, you can still dislike a video, but you no longer see who else dislikes that video. And so the explicit reason that YouTube stated for doing this was to reduce something called dislike attacks or dislike bombs, which is kind of a form of toxic online behavior where people target the dislike back button. And then after seeing how many other people have disliked that video, so there's kind of a form of herding going on. And importantly, this is not related to the inherent quality of the video. So before I dive into the details of the paper, I already want to give you a bit of an overview of the main results. So first of all, I document that on platform on YouTube, there was a gender gap in negative feedback prior to this platform design change. And so specifically, women seem to receive more negative feedback than men did for comparable content. And I will try to convince you throughout this study, this presentation, that I do the best I can to really make sure that the content that women respectively men produce really is comparable. Second, I show that after this change to the platform design, this gender gap seems to be eliminated. And this is because women experience a much larger decrease in dislikes than men, by about 21 to 24%. And I also show, and I see this, the main contribution of the paper is that the output produced by women increases by about 8.4%, and also the demand for their content increases by even more, by about 15.5%. And both of these effects are persistent, at least over the time frame that I study. In the remainder of the paper, I look at the different mechanisms that could help us understand explain these results and sort of what is really happening. And in particular, I try to understand what might be driving these gender differences in feedback received. And what I find, I'll just quickly finish my sentence and then we'll get to the questions. And what I find is that there seems to be at least some support for that some of these gender differences are driven by women receiving more of these dislike attacks. Yes, Dante?
When you look at substitutions from dislikes to comments, can you look at whether comments became more toxic or offensive, especially for that kind of for women's view?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So one of the obvious things that you might think might be happening is that people now know that the dislikes are less rewarding because you can't engage in these dislike attacks. You instead move to the comments instead. I'll get to that in the mechanism session, but briefly, what I see is that not much seems to happen to comments. If anything, they actually become slightly less negative. But there's the big caveat to this that the content creator can moderate the content on the comments, and I'm not able to sort of see whether the moderation intensity changes. So that's a big caveat there. But I've looked at the data I have, and I don't see big change. Yes.
Yeah. So I have a question regarding before and after, do you see the underlying population who watch female creators versus male creators, the population difference?
So unfortunately, I do not know a lot about who watches the videos or who dislikes the videos. That's a little bit of a black box, but I can tell you how many people watch the different types of content, but I can't tell you who's watching the content, if that's what your question is about. Yeah.
If I'm remembering the context was changed correctly, doesn't the creator of the video actually still see the dislikes
Exactly.
after
So
this change?
talk about that in 3 slides.
Okay.
And then maybe we can.
And I guess the other question is, how do we know if dislikes were decreasing? Because of course, now that they're non-public, now we can't observe them. Now, of course, there are some tools that enable this, but my understanding is these tools are actually pretty imperfect.
I agree with that, but no, yeah. So I'll just return to that in 3 slides.
How does the number of dislikes affect the viewership? Sometimes I'm actually attracted to videos that have many dislikes. So it's kind of bad publicity is better than not having any publicity at all.
So that might be possible, and this study actually abstract from that because I focus on a kind of content. You'll see that it's not really the kind of content that would thrive on that. So no clickbaity content. Maybe, yeah, I hope that also becomes clearer as I go through the setting. Yeah, I think maybe some more of the questions will become clearer once I start going through the details. So I won't spend a lot of time on the contribution. I think the 2 literature streams that are relevant for this audience, one is the relationship between, or the literature that studies how toxicity of online content affects both production of online content and consumption of online content. And this literature currently finds mostly that actually the toxicity drives aggregate production and consumption of content online, even if it comes at a cost of suppressing the content coming from the people targeted by the toxicity. What I think is important difference from these, in my paper, from these other papers, is that they mostly study something like a Twitter-like platform where the content creator and consumer are one of and the same group of people. Whereas in my setting, there's a clear difference between the person who's creating the content and the person who's engaging in this toxic behavior, which is why the outcome might be different. And also, I contribute to the literature that studies the biases in online reputation systems, and it's obviously a very broad literature, but I just want to highlight the two things. So one, there is some literature that documents gender biases in these online reputation systems, and there's also literature that documents how herding in reviews can lead to biased outcomes. And I kind of bring those 2 things together in this paper. So now I want to tell you more about the setting, though I don't think I need to tell much about YouTube to this audience. But as I said, YouTube is the largest platform for professional content creators. By some external estimates, there are about 1 million people who are professional content creators on YouTube, meaning they do this for their living. By YouTube's own estimates in 2021, the content creators on YouTube contributed over 400,000 full-time equivalent US jobs to the US economy. Another thing that I want to highlight that's relevant for this study is that while YouTube has tried to expand in other revenue streams, it's still very much an ad finance platform, meaning that ads are the largest revenue source both for YouTube and for the content creators, even if for larger content creators, other things become more important, such as sponsorships. But what this basically means is that both the platform and the content creators want to maximize the engagement with the content, the amount of views that the content receives, because ads are displayed alongside content. So the more content is being viewed, the more ad revenue you gain. And that's why sort of the outcome, one of the relevant outcomes I look at is the consumption or the views of content. Going to the more specific setting. So exactly what happened is the following. So prior to the platform design change, you could dislike a video, and you could also see how many other people have disliked that video. Now you could still dislike a video, but you no longer see how many other people have disliked that video. So there's no effect on whether you can give a dislike, but there is an effect on how the dislikes are displayed, and you can still see that. So the content creators, as though I think was mentioned, they can still see the dislikes, but the users do not, which means that the incentives for why you might choose to dislike a video change. So if previously you wanted to dislike, you chose to dislike a video because you wanted to inform your own personalized algorithm that you don't want to see similar content in the future, that's not affected. You can still do that. Importantly, this will only affect your own personalized algorithms and not any kind of like general algorithms on YouTube, recommendation algorithms. Second, if you want to let the content creator know what you think about the content, you can also still do that because they still see the dislikes. What changes is that if you wanted to let the other potential viewers of that content know what you think about the quality of the content, then this incentive disappears because they can no longer see the dislikes. Also, you're no longer able to engage in these dislike attacks because that kind of required these dislike counts as an implicit coordination tool. So these are the two types of dislikes you could say that disappear from the platform. Because yes, there's a question about Meng.
I'm curious. So you said that response algorithm still take the number of dislikes, right? But at the same time, if, for example, viewership is decreasing because nobody is disliking anymore, right?
Yeah.
Then that will implicitly affect the ranking of the video on YouTube. That would create selection of the viewership, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's no
algorithm is still impacted. It's not like that.
So dislikes do not impact the general algorithms directly, but exactly, they might still impact them indirectly. In my analysis, I try to kind of like abstract from that because I look at content creators and the same content creators both before and after the change, and I assume that on average they produce like similar quality content.
Second question real quick, how should we think of, so for example, content creators, if for example viewership is decreasing for them, do they really care about the dislikes? I mean, dislikes will probably encourage you psychologically, but at the same time, the goal is to have accurate. Your viewership is decreasing from like, would you have someone who is distribution of like, in terms of gender biases, will women still keep the same revenue as they were before this policy was changed or not? Like, I'm not sure if you have that.
So I think there's several things to what you say. The very last thing, so about the revenue. So I will look at the demand for the content, and that's very closely related to revenue. We see that it increases for women more than so for men. Maybe for the other things we can return to as I go through that through the paper. Yeah. So the last thing I want to mention here. And this is more related to when I like look at the mechanisms and these dislike attacks. So the way I think about these, how these might impact the distribution of dislikes in my sample is that if you have some sort of like a general bias against women, where people are just all slightly more negative about like evaluate women's content slightly more negatively on average, we should see that after the platform design change, the dislikes that women receive should kind of like decrease across the entire distribution about equally. Whereas if this gender gap that I document is instead driven by these dislike attacks, we should see a bigger decrease in very large dislike counts. But we'll get to that later on. Yes, and here I think that speaks to the question I had, the question that was there earlier, is that YouTube announced this change on the same day as they implemented this change on the platform. But luckily for me, they allowed to retrieve these dislikes from the platform for another 34 days after the change, in order to allow the web developers, etc., to adjust to the changes. Which means that I can observe how people behave while dislikes are still public, as well as for at least a limited time after the dislikes are no longer public. And this brings me to the data that I used in the analysis, and essentially this project combines 3 data sets. And the first data set, the data set in which I observe the dislikes as well as other engagement metrics, is a repeated cross-section of trending videos over time. The main analysis I focus on Canada and the United States, not least because that's, to my understanding, the setting in which these kind of dislike attacks have been discussed most, and therefore are maybe most relevant. Let me see if I can this that screen. Yeah, so I start with this trending videos data set in which I observe kind of a snapshot of dislikes, and therefore it warrants a kind of a little bit of discussion of what kind of videos do we have here in this sample. Again, it relates, I think, to a question that was there earlier. And so these trending videos are supposed to be kind of the kind of videos that appeal to broad audiences. So in this sample, we don't have the kind of content that might thrive on getting a lot of dislikes and therefore like get a lot of attention. So there's no kind of misleading clickbaity or sensationalist content in here. It might well be that, for example, for that kind of content, it's different effects. But instead, this content is broadly selected based on the view count, how quickly these views accumulate, where these views come from, so either from YouTube or outside of YouTube, how old the videos are, in the sense that very recent videos are prioritized, and also how well this specific video performs relative to your other content. And very importantly, as I already mentioned, these kind of general algorithms, including the trending video algorithm, is not directly affected by dislikes. While of course it might be that the dislikes play a role indirectly and the change in dislikes play a role indirectly.
Marita.
Yeah.
I find that counterintuitive because I would have imagined that dislikes affect recommendations, which then affects views, which defines trending. Am I thinking in the wrong way?
No, that is right. So exactly, they don't affect it directly, but they affect the algorithm indirectly, which is why in my analysis here I will follow. So what I have is I turn it into a panel, and I end up sort of only keeping the observations of the channels that appear in the sample both before and after, and kind of assuming that avoids or like kind of deals with the issue of selection or differential selection into trending videos after the change, if that's what you were kind of getting to. So there might be exactly, it might be that the way that the trending videos are selected changes over time, and especially after this change to the platform's design. And here, because I follow the same videos over time, at least in the short term, I assume that the average quality of that channel is kind of more fixed on average. Yeah.
On the related questions, so like if I'm a audience, right? I don't like this video, I dislike it, and that with the expectation that you will reduce how this video is recommended by the algorithms to others or to me. But the platform might actually enjoy the polarization, right? So we actually will recommend such videos to more people. And then with this gap here, create a problem.
I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at. I guess what I can tell you is that this is like a little bit of a select sample here of this kind of non-clickbaity content. So I don't think this is not polarizing content.
So the algorithms, would the algorithms promote videos that are more disliked or?
So the dislikes do not directly play a role in the algorithm.
Okay.
And I don't think it actually, at least for these trending videos, which are very, very popular videos, you see that here the dislikes, like more dislikes don't seem to lead to better performance. Yes, Ashwin?
So do you get to see like exactly what formula, because these are, the trending video ranking is determined by YouTube, right?
Yeah.
So you get to see explicitly what formula they're using. I guess, how do you know that they're not, because I guess dislikes might just be an engagement metric, right? Like if I think about Rebecca Black's Friday or something, 90% dislikes, trending everywhere.
So what I can tell, so you're asking what I know about the algorithm?
Yeah, how do you, because it seems like you should be using, like it should be informative soon now.
So actually they changed this. So this is what I know. This is what they reveal. They say that they have removed dislikes as a direct predictor from the algorithm about 2 years before the change that I studied, because they say that they are not very
I
informative.
see, but they say relative performance. I guess I would have thought performance here is not just.
So performance here is views. So the dislikes don't actually play a role. I can also tell you, so another piece of evidence there is that there was an external study, I think by the Mozilla Foundation, which likewise confirmed that dislikes don't seem to play a role in this algorithm.
Could you estimate that?
I could, I haven't, but I could, yeah, I have. I haven't. So kind of moving on from the algorithm. So another thing that I want to do is, because I'm interested in these gender differences, I want to limit my sample from like all these different kind of channels that in the sample to the ones that can clearly be attributed to individual content creators. And in the current analysis in the paper, what I do is I use facial recognition on the profile pictures of the content creators. And I say that if I can identify an individual face in a profile picture, then this channel is likely can likely be attributed to a single individual content creator. So in the first step, I identify all the channels as either belonging to an organization or an individual. So if they have a single person in a profile picture, and then the second step, I identify whether the individual is more likely to be male or a female individual. And here you see that while we generally, I think, associate content creation with, I think at least most people think there's more women who do this kind of like influence, like who are influencers who do this kind of content creation. On YouTube, actually, it's more male content creators. And the sample I end up with is 1,808 channels. And here, of course, I also hand code a subset of these channels just to see how well the algorithm performs. And what I can tell you is that it performs extremely well for male content creators, as in identifies them accurately by about 98% accuracy. For women, it's a slightly lower, I think it's the lower precision, so it's about 88%. But in this case, so this means that women are sometimes somewhat more likely to be wrongly classified as male, and men, not vice versa. But in this sample, this analysis, if anything, it downwards biases the estimate. So I'm not too worried about that. But one thing you might wonder about is like, so how comparable is really the content that men and women produce? And could it be that the differences that we observe are all just driven by the fact that men and women produce different types of content? And for that, I can tell you two things. So first, there's a number of characteristics along which the people or the content creators in my sample are comparable. So importantly, male and female content creators in my sample are comparable, or their content is comparable in terms of things that matter for the algorithm, such as the number of views or the age of the videos. They also are comparable in terms of rank, so how well they perform in the algorithm on average. But there are important differences. And the first important difference is that women tend to receive more dislikes and comments on average. And the other one is that women and men produce different types of content. Here I only present the very aggregate categories of content. I also have more detailed information on this, but in terms of aggregate categories, women produce a lot more lifestyle content and less entertainment, sports, and gaming content. And this is something I'll try to address in my analysis to convince you that the effects observed are not driven by these content differences. So then, based on these channels that I have in this trending video sample, for all these channels, I then retrieved a balanced panel of videos, so all the content they've produced over time to measure the output, any changes in the output by channel. And essentially what that means is I download all the I retrieve all the information from YouTube API on the videos that have been ever uploaded to a specific channel. And here you have a mini balance table, which essentially just shows that both the median and mean channel by a female content creator in the sample is somewhat smaller than that by a male content creator. And then similarly, I also collect demand per channel, which comes from a different platform, from socialplate.com. And this just gives me a balanced panel of views per channel over time. And here again, the mean is not different in terms of the number, like the number of views is not different at the mean between male and female content creators, but the median female content creator has somewhat of a lower demand than the median male content creator. So this is the data I work with. And before I get into the empirical analysis, I just want to start with a very simple descriptive statistic here with a very simple descriptive graph. And here, I'm not adjusting for anything, any content differences, anything, but this is the average number of dislikes for male, respectively female content creators prior to the platform design change. And we see that in this raw data, women seem to receive significantly more negative feedback, so significantly more dislikes than men do prior to the platform design change. Afterwards, however, we see big changes in the sense that both men and women see a decrease in the number of dislikes on average, but women see this decrease for women is much larger, so much so that now they seem to receive fewer dislikes on average than men do. So we see that already in this descriptive data that there's definitely some kind of like different response by gender to this platform design change. To kind of verify whether this actually holds empirically, once we account for these differences in the type of content men and women might produce, I estimate a simple two-way fixed effects or less regression in which I look at the log number of dislikes as the outcome, and then I'm interested in the interaction between the treatment timing dummy and the female dummy here. And of course, I control for a number of things, but most importantly, as I said, I try to account for the fact that women and men produce different types of content. So here in the baseline regressions, I do that by just accounting for channel fixed effects and the video category fixed effects, and these vary both within a channel and across channels over time. And the second sort of more precise measure that I use to account for differences is I predict the counterfactual dislikes that women's content would receive had it been produced or uploaded by men instead. And to do so, I estimate a lasso-based model where I take the dislikes as the outcome, and then I use a number of predictors. You saw many of those in the balance table, but then there's also more nuanced data. For example, the content, the topics. So there's about 37, I think, detailed categories, as well as the interactions between these predictors and the second degree polynomials. I use these to predict dislikes. And then the sample in which I train this model is the sample of pre-treatment dislikes, or videos prior to the treatment by men. Because after the treatment, men, as we saw, at least in the descriptives, are also treated, though to a lesser degree. And so the model ends up performing very well in the test data, as in it explains about 96% of variation in the test data, which is quite high. So in my interpretation, I'll just finish quickly and then get to the question. And my interpretation here is that that's because in the absence of these dislike attacks, so this kind of unexpected extreme outlier number of dislikes, you can actually predict dislikes fairly well based on both the views and the likes and the other characteristics like categories. Yes.
So do you find that after the change, people are compensating by liking Meng's video even more? Because then they can remove, an implication could be just remove the social aspect altogether for likes and dislikes. Then they start rewarding men more as opposed to dinging women.
So I have run essentially the same regression for likes and comments. And what I see is that for likes, actually, there's no difference, at least no significant. There's a negative effect on likes for women relative to men because I look at the relative differences. I don't recall, I've also looked at the absolute difference, but so it's not a significant, like there's a negative effect, but it's not significant in the main sample. So I don't think there's a lot of that going on in that case. It doesn't seem to at least be a thing that people talk about the way that they would have talked about these dislike attacks. Yes.
So I assume that in general, women produce content that is like the distribution of the types of content that women produce, the distribution of the type of content that men produce. It's overlapping, but not exactly the same distribution. I guess like how much is in this X that we think we're capturing what that content is, because insofar as they don't perfectly, or they're not perfectly the same, it seems like that will just load on your data that because in terms of if people like certain types of content are more polarizing than other types, right?
Okay.
The
So-
prototypical example being like beauty content or something like that is going to have a very high gender skew, and insofar as that's polarizing, then lifestyle content is going to have. But insofar as it's more polarizing, you're going to generate more dislikes, and you're going to read that as that being because they're a woman as opposed to being because they're producing content that's more.
Yeah, so the way I'm thinking, maybe two things I can say to that. So one is, I mean, first of all, you're right, there's different types of content, but the one thing is that, yeah, also these kind of counterfactual, like dislikes, they also explain a lot of the variation in the female content. Another perhaps more important argument here is that, as we saw in this balance table, so, sorry. Let me just talk through it. So we saw that, I mean, yes, there is few like, so I think the benefit here of the sample is that there's a lot more content by men than by women. So even in the kind of more niche topics like beauty, we'll still have some observations. So there's kind of enough support in the data to really identify these kind of content differences. Of course, you could still argue that even within these more general categories, there's still a lot of difference between how men and women.
I guess, could you remind me what an X is capturing the type of content that we're producing? Like you had some categories, right?
So in the baseline, this is just, yeah, the video categories. And then I have, as an alternative, I have these counterfactual dislikes, right?
I think the question is, what is?
What are the video categories?
What are the categories? All right.
And what else is in X?
Right.
This
Yeah.
seems like the first order.
Let's go into the details then. Yeah, so yeah, so there's likes, views, comments, the ratios, then exactly video and channel categories. So there's about 40 different channel categories, I think, and about 15 different video categories, and these can change within the channel, and there can be multiple of those assigned to the same channel. So I use these, and as you see, like a number of other things. But I think exactly these channel kind of differences is the main thing that this kind of relies on, or although much of the variation is already explained by the ratio, like relationship between likes, views, and dislikes, because as I said, in the absence of these extreme numbers of dislikes, actually there's a close relationship between those.
Yes, I think my question is really mostly about what are these sort of video channel categories and how much variation is explained by those? Is there a lot of playing? Should we believe that there is, of course, 14 is a lot of categories, but maybe it's less categories than there really are. Should we think that we've sort of captured everything there, or that there really isn't like, I don't have a super strong bias.
Yeah, so I think it's not perfect. I had thought about using so there's like these descriptive tags attached to each video. I had thought about using that, but given how well the model already performs, I did not end up doing that. So I think it's pretty good, but it's not perfect. Is how I would evaluate it.
I guess maybe building off that a little bit, like when I think of online content, I think of like a very long tail of potential interests. So 14 seems, reasonable, but maybe a little bit small, right, to really capture that variation. Oftentimes there are transcripts though that might be available for these. Of course, generative AI is great at kind of coming up with these labels. You might be able to create a really, really rich set of observables and therefore be able to push back a lot on these potential endogeneity.
Yeah, I think I agree with the transcripts. I do have the transcripts. I've been I've been wanting to use them for a slightly different purpose. I could use the transcripts. I wanted to start with a video descriptor, like these tags that are attached to each video, because these are supposed to be very informative, because that's what helps you find the video when you're searching for something. So that could be a better way to get at it, indeed. Now I start, so it's 40 categories, but of course that's still not enough.
Like 40, sorry.
Yeah, still, I get your point. Yeah.
So this policy could also affect the content creators, like quality of content or content decisions. Could it be the case that after this policy, male content creators are more likely to produce polarizing content because they are not maybe more concerned about these types of texts?
So I'll again get to that and the mechanism. So what I do see is that content quality does not seem to decrease. So thinking about it kind of in the vertical differentiation kind of sense. About the kind of horizontal differentiation is something that I still have to work on, but maybe we can discuss a little bit. I'm realizing yeah.
What's the purpose for using that specific class-based model compared to other models?
So in theory, it's supposed to be more help with interpretability if we compare it to a rich based model, but obviously here it's so many predictors that it still does not really help with that. I've also tried rich as another standard model, but I mean there was really no difference, so I just went with it as the honest answer. Let me just try to get through the main results, and then we can discuss. I think a lot of these things are also covered in the mechanisms. But yeah, so this is basically what I already said. So as I said, I have these two ways of trying to account for content differences currently. There are ways I could improve that further. But in the baseline, we see that in this baseline regression where I account for channel fixed effects as well as these video category fixed effects, we see a 21% decrease in dislikes for women relative to men after the platform design change. And we see that once accounting for this more nuanced measure of dislikes by including these predicted dislikes in the regression, or more nuanced measure of quality by including these predicted dislikes in the regression, this estimate increases to 24%, though it's not significant. So of course, I have to be careful about interpreting it, but what my takeaway is that if anything, women already select into content that's less likely to be subject to these dislike attacks. And at least it doesn't seem to me that these content category differences fully explain the differences in the negative feedback received. I also estimate two variations of this regression. One is, I of course want to understand what happens to men. And here, so what I do is I simply remove the time fixed effects to estimate the baseline kind of effect on men. And we see that in this, here it's consistently negative, but it's not significant in these, in this main sample of US and Canada. Once I expand this sample to other countries as well, in Europe, it becomes significant and it's negative about the same magnitude, but it's still much smaller than the effect of men. So my takeaway here is that men seem to be affected, but to a lesser degree.
I don't know if it's possible to measure, but I wonder if you consider doing this between sexualities within gender.
I have considered that. I had this information for a slightly different sample. I haven't, like, it's not overlapping with this main sample. Yeah, I have to think about whether I can add that. Actually, what I can tell you that is also not in this analysis currently is that, for example, when I do this facial recognition, I also look at race as identified by the facial recognition tool, and I do see similar patterns that, for example, Black people get a lot more negative feedback that I would like to include in the paper in the future, and perhaps also other dimensions. Yeah, okay, so I'll try to be quicker. So yeah, so then the other thing I look at, or the other variation of this analysis I look at is I want to understand, so what happens to the overall, the aggregate gender gap. And to do that, I split the sample in the pre-treatment, post-treatment sample and look at, and remove the fixed effects and look at what effect, whether we get, what effect we get for a female dummy in each sample. And so we see that prior to the platform design changes, positive effect, so women get more negative feedback, more dislikes than men do, and it's significant. After the platform design change, it's closer to 0 and it's not significant. So it seems that this eliminated gender gap in negative, this platform design change eliminated gender gap in negative feedback. So I'll try to be quick with the other analysis, but basically based on what we just saw, we see that women seem to be more affected by this platform design change, men less so, and that motivates my identification strategy for analyzing the effects on the content supply and demand. And here I basically run a standard differences regression where I have women as the treated group and men as the control group or the less treated group. And the outcome I look at for content supply is the monthly number of videos produced, log number of videos produced. And again, what we're interested here is the interaction between female and treatment dummy. And in most analyses that use a less treated group as the control group, this might be straightforward, but in this setting, but the important assumption here is that men and women would react the same way to the treatment. And that becomes less straightforward, perhaps in this setting, because we have seen in previous literature that men and women respond to feedback differently. So in support of this assumption, I can provide evidence that in a setting in which we do not observe these dislike attacks and therefore don't see gender differences in feedback, and specifically this seems to be Korea and Japan. We don't see, where we don't see this gender gap in negative feedback, we also don't observe any kind of differences in both content produced and the demand for the content. So I'm just going through these slides, but essentially it's just there's no significant effect or anything in these countries. And so with that, I want to go to the results. So yes, there's a question.
Sorry if I missed it. Are there also placebo tests for different time periods as well?
I have not included that now here, but I should include that.
But I'd be really curious about it.
Okay, yeah, I'll include that. Thanks. So yeah, so then going to the results, we see that video supply by women increases by about 8.4% a month relative to the control group to men, which for the median YouTube channel translates, in my sample, translates into about 0.4 videos a month. And here I want to just briefly show the event study, not only because, well, the parallel trends look nice, but also because I think it's nice to see that the effect seems to be relatively persistent over time. So at least within the time frame that I study, it does not seem to dissipate. And so then for studying the effect of demand, I estimate the same regression, essentially just with the log number of monthly views as the outcome. And here I see that the demand increases by even more, by 15.5% a month, which is more than the increase in video supply, implying an overall increase in views per video. And in this sample, very select sample of highly popular channels, this translates into about 500,000 more views a month for the median channel in the sample, or by some measures up to $3,000 increase in monthly revenues from advertising alone. Take that with a lot of salt, because we don't know actually much about different advertising revenues that the content creators get. So I'll just briefly highlight, because I believe I have like 2 minutes or something. I'll briefly highlight one, so I look at different mechanisms, but I want to briefly highlight one analysis, and that's looking at, so trying to understand what's behind this gender gap in negative feedback. And here, as I said, I want to see whether that kind of stems from like more general bias against women, where everyone's like slightly more negatively evaluating slightly more negatively the content by women, or is it something that comes more from these dislike attacks? And to do that, I look at heterogeneity of the effect across the dislike distribution simply by estimating a quantile regression, which is essentially the same regression as you saw before, except now we estimate an effect at each different quantile or decile in my analysis. And here I see that, so this is the effect on the interaction between timing, like treatment and female dummy, and we see that, so the women seem to see a bigger decrease in dislikes almost across the entire distribution, but it's particularly large in the very high dislike counts. So kind of like showing that, like suggesting that at least some of this effect seems to be driven by a reduction in these dislike attacks. Since I don't think I have, or I think I'm out of time, I'm just gonna move straight to the conclusion. And then see if there's any other questions. But yeah, just to conclude that we see that platform design influences how users interact on this kind of content creation platforms. And we also see, and this paper also documents that biases in feedback can then lead to significant effects in different economic outcomes. And in this specific setting, I focus on differences between women and men, showing that women receive significantly more negative feedback than men do, and that this kind of change that YouTube instituted, where they removed the public dislike counts, led to elimination of this gender gap, which then led to both positive effects of both content produced by women as well as the demand for it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me thank the conference organizers for this great opportunity for me to be able to discuss this wonderful paper, which I truly enjoyed reading this paper. So, so Marita did a wonderful job presenting the key results and insights from her paper. So I will devote the time today. So my job here as a discussant is to help sell the paper by really highlighting various strengths of the paper. And also on top of that, I'm going to talk about some of the thoughts, really, food for thought for Marita to think about. So hopefully, enrich what's already a very strong paper. All right. So as you can see, some of my points will be very similar to the questions asked by the audience. So, yeah, I mean, it just sometimes it bugs me to think that, the points that I thought about after 3 days of, reading the paper is actually the points that you guys can make on the fly. So, anyway, so the big picture problem that I think about is the economics of the visible hand, pun intended, right? So these hands, some downs and some ups, will be really a great representation of the full set of market designs or the rating system that can make the market, the invisible hand, better by improving the market efficiency, because they are just so cheap. They are low cost of providing feedback, right? So they are instantly and readily available, which means that we can mitigate some of the concerns that can affect the market efficiency, such as adverse selection and moral hazard. But just because they are so cheap and instant, they can open the door to unfair, abusive, and toxic feedback, which may hurt some groups more than others. Right? So here, this is a question that I give to ChatGPT in the most gender neutral way as possible, to show me an image of a social media influencer who receive lots of unfair, negative comments and feedback, some of which are highly toxic. And look what we have. It's a woman that is surrounded by thumbs downs, right? So this is really, the paper in one slide.
So I think this goes beyond affecting people's experience, right? In that it affects our lives and livelihood to the extent that we are evaluated, so frequently and in various roles that we take. For example, we are evaluated as researchers, as educators, as content providers, as creators, so on and so forth. So this can bear very important downstream consequences in that, it helps determine who gets to be seen, who gets to be rewarded, and who gets to, survive the, ultimately survive the economic gain, so to speak. So in that, I think this paper is really great because it really contributes to the intersection of gender bias and the digital economy. So the way, the reasons I really, really like about this paper is that, first of all, I believe it makes important and unique contribution. So because we know so much about, the gender bias in various traditional settings, on outcomes such as wage, promotion, career paths, so on and so forth. But our knowledge and insights are still catching up with the ongoing digital economy. For example, the gig economy and the creator economy are really changing the way that we organize the labor market, which means that we may exacerbate or perpetuate the bias that is already deep-rooted in our system, right? But this also means great opportunities for us researchers, because the high frequency rich data can allow us to get a detailed visibility into how gender bias came about in the first place in digital economy and how it gets amplified over the feedback loop, so to speak, and how it affects labor market participation and productivity of certain groups. So with that, I think this paper is really important and timely. And overall, I think another reason to like about this paper is that this identification is fairly convincing. So for two reasons. First of all, they have this, Marita has this nice quasi-experimental setting where you have this sudden removal of the public display of dislikes, which happened overnight, meaning that individual users of the platform do not anticipate and react accordingly. And also, I think this is a major design change, not minor adjustments. And also, it's very good to have this technical, not really technical glitch, but this opportunity to be able to observe how they send dislikes in private, although the public display is eliminated. And secondly, Marita really has done a lot to rule out some obvious, alternative explanations. For example, channel by country fixed effects, video topic fixed effects, as well as this video specific unobserved quality, which can be captured by the machine learning, constructed counterfactual. What if it was done by a male influencer instead? So with that, I would just, highlight all the strength of this paper that makes this, really a strong study. Now, what I'm going to do for the rest of the time is to talk about, some of my comments. First of all, my comment is about, how we can interpret the result and what is really the treatment, the nature of the treatment here. So it looks like Marita has been attributing most of the outcome as, people behave, as a consequence to the removal of the public display of dislikes. So I totally believe there's some behavioral interpretation to it. But on top of that, could there be any selection going on? Could it be, both behavioral selection that is interacted together, right? So it seems that the underlying DGP, the data generating process, this author proposes is that we can hold fixed the algorithm, right? And we can control for the number of views. So whatever that is, happening as a result can be explained by people, sending less dislikes as a result of the design change, right? But there's some caveat if you think about it. It really depends on the information or the signal versus noise carried out, embedded in this these dislikes, right? So let's think about examples. So I have two otherwise similar videos, okay? They both have 1,000 views. The left one gets 100 likes, so it's the right one, except that, the case on the right gets 5 dislikes. So although we can say that the left case is a true positive, the true high quality one, but it remains, a question mark, how we can, think about the quality, the true underlying ground truth about the quality of the case on the right. Is it true positive, given that the 5 dislikes can be entirely unfair or unwanted, unwarranted feedback, or is it really representing information in that they are just, fair representation of user experience? So if you believe there's some element of false positive here, then an alternative DGP or a parallel DGP that can be happening at the same time is that although we can fix the initial round of algorithm recommendation, but in the short run, people may be confused, right? They may be, mistakenly think that this false positive, this low quality, as if it's, the high quality one. And therefore, it will lead to more views of the false positive. And then what this means is that once we get more views and more initial push from the design change, people may be less likely to give dislikes, although they might feel personally that they are not satisfied with this video. But to the extent that there's this observational learning and herding going on after you remove the displays of the dislikes, then people are less likely to express their dissatisfaction, which means that false positive may have fewer dislikes initially. But then what's interesting is that this initial push for false positive can get amplified in later processes, because whatever this is happening can be feedback into the next round of algorithm recommendation, which can feed to sustained growth for low quality videos. So what I'm saying is really about how to think about the case on the right. Is it true positive or false positive, or a little bit of both, right? So it really depends on, are we really, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? So in terms of information design for the perspective of the platform, are we removing a lot of useful information together with the noise? I think that's a very complicated question, but if the author, using the current data, can do some sort of local RDD, which can shed light to that question. For example, if you can find some way to identify otherwise similar true positive and false positive cases on the margin, you can track how things unfold and propagate over time for them to let you speak to the strength of these parallel processes. So that is comment one, which regards to the interpretation, the mechanism that is going on. Secondly, I want to briefly talk about the potential spillover effect to the extent that men and women are competing on this platform. So whatever we observe as the net effect can be, we are benefiting women at the cost of hurting men. At least there's some sum game nature to it. So what I think, the way that I think about it is that this motivates a cross-category analysis by female-male competition. You can compare categories that are more subject to gender competition versus other that are dominated by one gender, and see if you can see something about the extent to which spillover effect is explaining what you see here. But let's take a step back to think about whether this is really more of a bug than a feature. So it really depends on your primary objective, whether you want to get a really a less biased estimate of the causal effect that is less subject to this Stuttgart violation, or you want to really speak to the global treatment effect that cannot be get if you only treat certain individuals while holding other individuals constant, right? So it's really a trade-off between a more biased estimate of the gender bias and a less biased estimate of the global treatment effect once you have a total switch of the market design. So to that, I don't think this is really more of a bug. I think this is more of a feature if you really want to emphasize this global treatment effect you are looking at. You're looking at. And thirdly, this is perhaps another paper, is to really think about the extension and what you can do more broadly. and how you can link this gender bias to market design problems and platforms incentives accounted for. So while reading the paper, I kept thinking, what is in it for the platform? I think this is a very important question because we want to make sure, or we want to know if the platform is incentive aligned to help create a better and more fair environment. But if you think about the total effect for the platform, it's super complicated and unclear. Why? For the reason I said in comment 1, this is the information design, right? Once you eliminate the bias associated with dislikes, you are also removing a lot of the information. So in the short run, whether we are achieving better outcomes really depends on, the information or signal versus noise. And secondly, it really depends on, this specific context, whether controversies are good for engagement, right? So which, relates to platform culture. And also, if you think about it, beyond the short run, there's this long run considerations, right? Maybe, entry and exit decisions are, more relevant in the long run, and innovation as well, which can ultimately speak to the choices of certain market designs that can help perpetuate some of the bias. But I think there's, again, some hope to it, right? You can do something to shed light on the total demand and supply to speak to the platform incentives by comparing different categories that are more and less exposed to dislike attacks. So if we find more positive total market outcome change in categories that were more exposed to dislike attacks, then that kind of sends a positive signal in terms of incentive alignment from the platform's perspective. Okay, so again, with that said, a big thumbs up for this paper. And it's big.
I guess I'll try to keep my response very brief so I won't keep everyone away from lunch. First of all, thanks so much, Meng. These are all things I've kind of thought about, but I think you definitely provide like an additional perspective on things that I haven't fully thought through yet. So maybe the one comment I wanted to respond to a little more, because I didn't get to that in the analysis, but or in the presentation, but exactly I want to. So one thing I definitely want to do more on is trying to kind of like figure out of like what are the underlying mechanisms for the supply and the demand effects we observe. And so the way I currently am thinking about it is that the effect we observe is a kind of a combination of kind of, let's say, 3 things. So one, exactly, you might have a behavioral supply side story where people just, this kind of like dislike attacks are a form of like cognitive cost, and you remove those, and so it becomes relatively cheaper to produce content. On the other hand, it also might be, but there might be a demand side response in the sense that obviously now the signal you get about the quality of the videos changes, and it might be good for those that were previously more affected and not so good for the other ones because you have less information to go by. And that, exactly as you said, might be then, I think this dimension might be amplified by the algorithm. And that I haven't, so I'm thinking of ways of trying to kind of like to kind of like separate the supply side and the demand side effects by, for example, looking at settings where the supply side can't really respond. For example, just starting with people who just always produce 1 video per week or something and see how the demand side develops there. But for the kind of like separating the immediate kind of effect on like how people read interpret the quality of the video now differently from the one that where the algorithm might then pick it up and sort of kind of amplify it. I still have to think about how to go about it, whether that would be possible to separate. I don't know. I guess I'm out of time, so maybe I'll just take the rest of the questions with Meng. But thank you so much. It was very